In 1978, the company that ran the butcher's shop on your corner turned a profit of more than £2.33 million. On all of it, it handed the taxman £10. The shop was Dewhurst, red and white, sawdust on the floor, standing on nearly every high street in the land. The family behind it were the Vesteys, the second wealthiest household in Britain after the royals themselves. This is the story of how the homeliest name on the British High Street belonged to the largest and most secretive food empire the world had ever seen. Hold on to that £10, because it is neither a misprint nor the whole of it. When the Sunday Times finally untangled the arrangement in 1980, its investigators found the family had been paying trivial sums like this for more than 60 years, a scheme that let them legally sidestep an estimated £88 million in tax. The men who ran it were lords of the realm. Asked to explain himself, one simply shrugged. Nobody pays more tax than they have to, and we're all tax dodgers, aren't we? A Conservative grandee of the day, Lord Thornycroft, heard the whole story and offered only 3 words. Good luck to them. And here is the part that dropped the country's jaw. The Vesteys were no obscure offshore trust, hiding behind a nameplate. They were everywhere. They owned the largest private meat business on the planet. They were, at their height, the largest private landowner in all of Australia. They ran the largest refrigerated shipping fleet on any sea, and the largest cold storage company on Earth, and they owned the shop you walk past every single day. The old line about them, repeated in the city with a kind of awe, was that the Vesteys were so rich they did not live off the interest on their fortune. They lived off the interest on the interest. So the question underneath this whole story is a simple one. How does a family become that powerful, that visible, threaded into the daily life of a nation, and still owe it almost nothing? To answer it, go back to a cold storeroom in Liverpool, and to 2 brothers who worked out something about meat that nobody else had grasped. William Vestey and Edmund Vestey were the sons of Samuel Vestey, a provisions merchant in Liverpool. They began as office boys in their father's business, and might have stayed there had the elder not been sent across the Atlantic. In 1876, William, still a teenager, went to Chicago, the beating heart of the American meatpacking trade. What he saw there changed the shape of his life. He watched, astonished, as vast quantities of good meat were thrown away because there was no way to reach the people who wanted it before it spoiled. Where others saw rubbish, William Vestey saw a fortune on the floor. He set up a small operation to can that surplus as corned beef and ship it home to Britain, where cheap meat was something the working poor could only dream of. That was the first insight. The second was colder and far more valuable: refrigeration. By 1890, William had moved to Argentina and begun experimenting with freezing, exporting, of all things, frozen partridges to the British table. Game birds first, then the real prize, beef and mutton, shipped frozen across the ocean and landing on British docks still fit to sell. Refrigeration turned the whole planet into Britain's larder. The grasslands of Argentina, the outback of Australia, the plains of Brazil, all of it could now feed the terraced streets of Liverpool and London and Leeds. The Vesteys were among the very first to grasp that whoever controlled the cold controlled the meat. Understand what that meant to an ordinary British household, because it is the foundation of everything the family became. Before the frozen ships, fresh beef was a luxury. The poor tasted rarely, and the very poor almost never. Cheap frozen meat put a Sunday roast within reach of families who had never dreamed of one. The Vesteys grew rich by selling not luxuries, but the everyday necessities a whole population had to buy, at a price no rival could match, and a scale nobody else could imagine. That was the pattern they would repeat for 100 years. Find the thing everyone needs, own every step of getting it to the table, then undercut the world. They did not stop at meat. As early as 1906, they reached China, building plants to freeze and ship eggs back to Britain, where cheap Vestey egg quietly fed the rise of the great catering houses, the tea rooms and corner cafes a firm like J. Lyons was building across the country. Wherever there was a hungry nation and a gap in the cold chain, they were already there, filling it. In 1897, back home, the brothers founded the company that would become the spine of everything, Union Cold Storage. They built refrigerated warehouses across Britain, then across Russia, the Baltic and Western Europe, a chain of frozen fortresses holding back decay. And then they did the thing that made them not merely rich, but untouchable. They began to buy the entire journey. Think how many hands a piece of meat passed through on its way to a British plate, each taking a cut. The rancher who raised the animal, the slaughterhouse that killed it, the shipping line, the dock, the cold store, the wholesaler who sold it on, and at the very end the butcher who cut it for your family. Every link a separate business, every business taking its slice. The Vesteys looked at that long chain and made a decision of breathtaking ambition. They would own all of it, from the animal in the field to the joint in your basket. So they bought the ranches. During the First World War alone, they acquired something like 6 million acres of the Australian interior, becoming the largest private landowner on the continent. In 1914, they bought a cattle station in the Northern Territory called Wave Hill, 3,000 square kilometres of it. Remember that name, it will come back to haunt this story. By the mid-1920s, Union Cold Storage had over 450,000 head of cattle grazing on Vestey land in Australia, South America and South Africa, and its own slaughterhouses beside its own herds. In Buenos Aires, it opened a refrigeration plant so vast it could process 1.5 million cattle and 2.5 million sheep a year, one of the largest on earth. Then they bought the sea. To carry the frozen meat home, they founded their own shipping line, the Blue Star Line, the largest refrigerated fleet in the world, around 40 ships crossing the oceans by the end of the 1930s, each a floating cold store flying the family's Blue Star. They bought the cartage firms that moved the meat off the docks, and Union Cold Storage swelled into the largest cold storage company on the planet, over 10 million cubic feet of capacity, handling a fifth of all the frozen meat Britain imported, and a full third of the nation's cold storage. By the mid-20s, it employed more than 30,000 people. The First World War, which starved so many businesses, fattened this one. As meat prices surged and the government scrambled to feed an army, the Vesteys supplied it, and the business grew by roughly a third. In 1920, they sold the British government £7 million worth of beef in a single deal. Then they kept buying. In 1934, they swallowed William Anglis and Company, the largest meat business in all of Australia, folding a rival continent's supply into their own. By the time William Vestey died in 1940, the firm the two office boys had built was conservatively valued at more than £90 million, an almost unimaginable sum. And a generation later, the machine still dwarfed the field. As late as the 1960s, the Vesteys remained the largest cold storage operator in Britain, standing shoulder to shoulder in the meat trade with the great American packing giants, Armour and Swift, the titans of Chicago. A family from Liverpool had built something to rival the biggest food corporations in the world, and had done it almost entirely in private, with no shareholders, no publicity, answerable to no one but themselves. And at the very end of that long chain, where the meat finally met the public, sat the butcher's shop. The Vesteys bought those too in their thousands. Old chains with names like Nelson's and Eastman's and Fletcher's absorbed one after another, until by the early 1920s, the family's shop network numbered somewhere near 3,000 outlets. Those shops would eventually be gathered under a single, friendly, unthreatening name: Dewhurst, the master butcher. If you are old enough, you can probably still picture one. The bold red and white frontage in nearly every town, sawdust across the tiled floor to catch the drip and the trimmings, a long marble counter, cold to the touch, and behind it a man in a striped apron and often a straw boater, drawing a knife down a steel with a sound like a struck bell. The window hung with joints, the day's price chalked on a board. You asked for what you wanted, and it was cut there and then, wrapped in white paper, tied with string, handed over with a word about the weather. To a whole generation of Britons, Dewhurst was not a corporation. It was simply where the meat came from, as ordinary and permanent as the postbox on the corner. Almost nobody queuing there on a Saturday morning had the faintest idea that the shop was the smallest, most human-sized tip of one of the largest business empires on earth. That is the machine. A closed circuit of meat and money, that began in the mud of an Australian paddock and ended in a paper parcel handed across a marble counter to your grandmother, and at no point along that entire journey did the meat leave the family's control, or the money leave the family's pockets. Nobody else in the trade had ever owned the whole road from field to counter. You can still see a fragment of that empire on the south bank of the Thames. There is a tower there, elegant Art Deco, and near the top, on all four sides, 3 stacked windows shaped as a circle, a cross, and a circle. They spell out a word, OXO. The building was rebuilt at the end of the 1920s by a firm the Vesteys had bought, the Liebig Extract of Meat Company, makers of the OXO stock cube. The family had wanted an illuminated advertising sign up there, but advertising along that stretch of river was banned, so their architect built the brand into the windows themselves. A great glowing advertisement that was not, technically, an advertisement at all. If the rules stand in your way, you do not break them. You build around them so cleverly the rule never quite catches you. The cube was a small miracle of the same ingenuity. It began with a German chemist, Justus von Liebig, who worked out how to boil cheap cuts of beef into a concentrated extract, a liquid essence of the animal. The liquid was clever but costly, so his company made a solid version, a little cube of compressed flavour a poor family could drop into a pot to make thin food taste of meat. That was OXO, and when the Vesteys bought the firm, they bought their way straight into the national store cupboard. The same purchase gave Britain another of its most familiar tastes. Far away in Uruguay, the Vesteys now owned an industrial meat works at a town called Fray Bentos, a name still stamped on tins in British cupboards today. The plant was so vast and so efficient, it was nicknamed the Great Kitchen of the World. It boasted that it used every part of the animal except the moo, turning what it could not can into extract, and the rest into fertilizer, glue, even dice carved from the bones. A single cow yielded something like 1,470 tins of corned beef. In 1943 alone, at the height of the Second World War, it shipped more than 16 million cans across the Atlantic to feed the Allied armies. Soldiers came to love that corned beef so much, they nicknamed one of their armoured tanks after it, the Fray Bentos. Around that plant, an entire town had grown, a company world in miniature, a quarter known as the Barrio Anglo, rows of small brick houses along the river, with its own hospital, school, social club, even its own football team. Men came from across Uruguay and dozens of other countries to labour in the killing rooms and stir the great vats of broth. It was in its way a marvel. It was also the source of one of the darker chapters in the story, because in 1964 an outbreak of typhoid tore through the Scottish city of Aberdeen, sickening hundreds, and investigators traced it to a batch of corned beef from that very plant. The tins had been cooled with untreated water drawn straight from a filthy river, carrying the contamination into British kitchens. It was a reminder in the worst possible way of what it meant to feed a nation from the far side of the planet through a chain owned by a single family. The system that could carry cheap food to every town in Britain could carry contamination just as fast and from just as far. And the honours came, as honours do to men that rich. In 1922, William Vestey was made a baron. It was said the title had, in effect, been purchased through gifts to the governing party, and that King George V was intensely annoyed to see it handed over. The office boy from Liverpool was now a lord, his brother Edmund a baronet the year before. The family had reached the very summit of British society, and yet, for all that visibility, the Vesteys themselves stayed remarkably hidden. Journalists met a wall of glossy silence, a family who appeared in society magazines beside their horses and country houses and revealed nothing of how the money worked. The name stood on every shop front in the country while the family stayed out of sight, behind trusts and holding companies and foreign addresses. By the 1980s, at its peak, Vestey Brothers was reckoned the largest privately owned multinational in the world and the largest meat retailer anywhere. Conservative estimates put the family fortune around £2 billion, second in all of Britain behind only the royal family. Behind a butcher's shop on your corner sat the biggest private company on earth. To understand how the Vesteys kept nearly all of it, look at one quiet decision made in the middle of the First World War, humming away underneath everything for the next 60 years. In 1915, at the height of that war, William Vestey went to the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and asked for a special exemption from British income tax. He was refused, and so the brothers did something that tells you exactly who they were. They packed up and left. They moved to Buenos Aires and ran their British empire from abroad, beyond the reach of the taxman, while that empire went on selling meat to British families every hour of every day. Later they arranged their affairs through a trust administered in Paris, so intricate the Inland Revenue would spend decades failing to crack it. The genius lay in the very thing they had built. Because the family owned every link in the chain, they could decide what each link charged the next. The ranch to the shipping line to the cold store to the shops. They set those prices so that by the time the meat reached the British till, the profit had already been booked somewhere far away. The meat was British and the customers British, yet on paper the profit had been carried off somewhere else entirely. That is the cold engine at the centre of the story. And a machine that clever, run by men who thought about money that carefully, was just as cold about the people who did the actual work. That coldness, in the end, would matter more than the money. It is what would finally turn a whole country against them. To see it clearest, we return to Wave Hill. The land the Vesteys ran their cattle on was the traditional country of the Gurindji people, who had lived there for tens of thousands of years before any British firm drew a fence across it. Gurindji men worked that station as stockmen, Gurindji women as domestic servants, and for decades they were barely paid at all. Here is the detail that makes it darker still. Until 1968, it was perfectly lawful to pay an Aboriginal worker in goods, rather than money, up to a fixed and pitiful limit. So the family did exactly that. An official inquiry found that Vesteys were not even meeting the meagre minimum set for Aboriginal workers, and that where those workers were owed government benefits, the money was often paid not to them, but into the pastoral company's own accounts, over which they had no control at all. Instead of wages, they were handed rations: flour, sugar, tea, tobacco. They lived in corrugated iron humpies without floors, without sanitation, without lighting. One Gurindji man, Pincher Mangwari, said it in a single sentence that cut straight through everything. 45 years, he said, I worked for Vesteys. Bread, salt, beef, a little bit of tea and sugar. That's all. Read that against the £10 of tax and the £2 billion fortune and the interest on the interest, and you understand the true shape of the thing. On the 23rd of August, 1966, a Gurindji elder named Vincent Lingiari led around 200 stockmen, house servants and their families off Wave Hill Station, and they refused to go back. What began as a protest over wages became something far larger, a demand for the return of their own stolen land. They camped at a place called Wattie Creek and held their ground year after year, while the whole of Australia slowly turned to watch. Unions backed them. Writers and students and ordinary people backed them. They petitioned the Governor-General. They sent their leaders on tours to tell the story. And still, for a long time, nothing moved. 9 long years they waited. At one point, Lord Vestey himself, feeling the pressure, offered to hand back a small portion of the station, some 90 square kilometres out of the millions of acres the family held. And in 1975, in a moment now burned into that country's memory, the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam knelt and poured a handful of red desert soil into Vincent Lingiari's open hand, returning a portion of the land to its people. The story was later turned into one of Australia's most beloved songs, From Little Things, Big Things Grow. The empire that paid £10 of tax had at last been made to give something back, and it had been forced to do so by the very people it had paid the least, a group of stockmen who put down their tools and walked out into the desert rather than accept it any longer. Now, before the reckoning, keep one uncomfortable thing in mind. Everything they had done, the flight to Buenos Aires, the trust in Paris, the £10 of tax, was entirely legal. That is what would make the coming scandal so hard to punish and harder to forgive. When the country finally learned the full truth, in 1980, there was no crime to charge. Only the slow dawning realization of how the game had really been played and who had been paying for it all along. The reckoning came from a newspaper. In 1980, the Sunday Times published its long investigation, and it landed like a bomb. There in black and white was the figure no one could quite believe. the Dewhurst chain, the friendly butcher on 10,000 street corners, had made a profit of more than £2.33 million and paid the nation £10 of tax on it, a rate so small it barely existed. The paper's verdict was withering, an immensely wealthy dynasty which for more than 60 years had paid trivial sums in tax. The country was furious, and the family's response poured petrol on the flames. Rather than apologise or hide, Edmund Vestey faced the press and delivered the line that would follow the family name forever. "Let's face it," he said, "nobody pays more tax than they have to. We're all tax dodgers, aren't we?" He insisted, correctly, that everything had been done strictly by the rules, and to the benefit of the country. The public did not agree. It had just been shown, in a single unforgettable number, exactly how the very rich arrange the world, and how little the rules mean when you can afford to hire the men who write around them. For years the family shrugged it off. The matter, one of them said grandly, had been taken to the highest court in the land, and as far as he was concerned, it was settled. And in the courts, astonishingly, the Vesteys usually won. On one rare occasion, the Inland Revenue tried to force the issue, presenting a demand covering just 4 years of the family's income, tax on more than £4 million, and a further surtax on more than £7 million. Even that narrow slice would have been a colossal bill. The Vesteys took it to court and won. If the revenue could not collect even that, over 4 years, from men this rich, what hope did it have of collecting the 60 years the newspaper had exposed? The loophole held. It would not be closed by Parliament until 1991, 76 years after William Vestey first fled to Buenos Aires to escape it. And there is a final, quiet detail that captures the absurdity better than any speech. In 1993, after years of public pressure, the Queen herself at last agreed to pay income tax. When the news reached Lord Vestey, he is said to have smiled and remarked that this now made him the last one, the last great household in the land still arranging, with perfect legality, to pay almost nothing. He said it as a joke. History has not found it especially funny. But here is the turn the family never planned for. The empire was already dying, and it was not the taxman that killed it, nor the outrage in the newspapers. It was something far more ordinary, rising on every high street at the very moment the scandal broke: the supermarket. The Vesteys had built their fortune on one idea, that whoever controlled the chain from field to counter controlled the trade. A new kind of business learned the same lesson and pushed it further. The great supermarket chains could buy meat in volumes that dwarfed even the Vesteys, sell it more cheaply than any Dewhurst, and put it under one roof with everything else a family needed. Shoppers stopped walking to the butcher. Why queue at 3 shops when one would do? The corner butcher, that fixture of British life as permanent as the church and the pub, began to vanish, and Dewhurst, the largest chain of them all, vanished fastest. The family had made it worse for themselves. Flush with cash, they had pushed the business out of meat and into property and other ventures, buying in near the top of the market just before it fell out from under them. The recession of the early 1990s did the rest. By then, the heart of the Vestey business was drowning in debt, something in the order of £423 million, and the interest on it was no longer being outrun by the interest on their fortune. For the first time in a century, the machine was losing money faster than it could make it. In 1992, the family announced it would close 600 of its remaining 1,000 Dewhurst shops, 2 out of every 3 gone in a single stroke. The same year, the last great Australian cattle stations were sold off, and a bitter Lord Vestey declared the family would never invest in Australia again. The empire that had taken 3 generations and half the planet to build was dismantled in a few years. The end, when it came, was swift and total. In 1995, the core of the family's empire, the old company that traced right back to Union Cold Storage, collapsed into receivership. Dewhurst went into administration the same year. A management buyout rescued a couple of hundred shops, and the name limped on for another decade, smaller and sadder each year. In 1998, the Blue Star Line, that once mighty fleet, was sold off for £60 million, and in the mid-2000s, the Dewhurst name was sold again, and finally slid into administration around 2006. The red and white shopfronts that every Briton over a certain age can still picture, the sawdust, the man in the straw boater, the joint wrapped in paper and string, were switched off for good. The name that had stood on the high street for the better part of a century was simply gone. Now let us be honest about one thing, the way this channel always tries to be. When people speak of Dewhurst having 3,000 shops at its peak, that figure belongs to the empire's earliest years, to the swarm of butcher chains the Vesteys swallowed in the 1920s before gathering them under one name. By the time the sign on every one of those shops actually read Dewhurst, the number was smaller, and by the 1990s smaller again. But that does not shrink the story. If anything, it sharpens it. The point was never the exact count of shops. It was that this one family, for the better part of 100 years, stood at the end of nearly every chain of meat in the country, took its cut of nearly every Sunday dinner, and answered to almost no one. Walk a British high street today and you will not find Dewhurst. You will find a phone shop, or a charity shop, or a shuttered unit with the ghost of old lettering still faint above the door. But the family did not fall with their name. Even as the meat empire burned around them, the Vesteys were moving what capital they could salvage into new ground, and one of the places it landed was fruit. The dynasty that had fed Britain its beef reinvented itself, among other things, as one of the country's biggest importers of bananas. The family remain among the wealthy households of Britain. Their fortune counted in the hundreds of millions, their acres spread across a 5,000-acre estate in the Cotswolds, a great stretch of a Scottish island, and a sporting estate in the north of England. The corner shops are gone, and the men who work the ranches are gone, but the money, carefully, quietly, remains exactly where it was always kept. And the tower still stands on the Thames, its windows still spelling out a word, though the meat company that built it is long dead. It is flats now, and a restaurant where people pay a great deal to look at the view. Far across the ocean, the great kitchen of the world at Fray Bentos sits silent, a rusting cathedral of empty vats and hanging chains and dead machinery. It has been preserved and listed as a place of world heritage, kept so visitors can walk the killing rooms and cold stores and grasp what it once meant to feed half the planet from a single riverbank. The town still lives, but the plant that was its heart and its oxygen has been dark for decades, a monument to a whole way of feeding the world that has quietly passed away. The soil that Gough Whitlam poured into Vincent Lingiari's hand is still Gurindji land, and the Queen, in the end, paid her tax. Only one thing never really came back, that £10, a profit of more than £2 million, and a tax bill of 10 on the most familiar shop in the country. It was no accident, and it broke no law, which is the very reason it has never quite faded from memory. The family had built something that reached around almost every dinner table in Britain, and had arranged their affairs so that, when the bill for Britain itself came due, they were barely part of the place at all. The shops had felt as permanent as the pavement they stood on. Now they are gone, and what remains is the estate, the silence, and one small, unforgettable number, still sitting on the ledger like a question no one in power ever quite managed to answer. If you enjoyed this one, YouTube reckons you're going to like the video already waiting for you on your screen right now. Go on, give it a watch.